Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Energy Storage and Distributed Energy Resources Phase 4 discussion on the final proposal. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by Jill Powers, Lauren Carr, Bridget Sparks, Gabe Murtaugh, and John Gooden, all from our Infrastructure and Regulatory Policy team, as well as Bill Weaver, our Senior Counsel, and Tyler Dubester and Greg Ford, our subject matter experts. The presentation for today's call is available on the initiative webpage. This call is being recorded. The recording is for informational and convenience purposes only, and any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We will be taking questions throughout the call today, and you can enter the question queue at any time by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. I'd just like to remind everyone to please start by introducing yourself before asking your question. So with that, I will hand it over to Jill Powers, and she will go through our initiative schedule.
Great, thank you. And good morning, everybody. Great to not see you, but getting back on our ESDER 4 schedule. We do have a schedule update for you. This schedule, as you see, includes a split out of a particular element of the ESDER 4 proposals that we are going to be further developing. However, we have multiple elements within the final proposal that was posted on August 20th that will be going to the Board of Governors on September 30th. October 1st is the actual Board of Governors meeting. Having our stakeholders calls today, we will be receiving comments on the final positions of those proposals going to the Board of Governors, as well as doing a presentation as an advisory presentation to the EIM governing body in September. We have decided to split out the ESDER 4 default energy bid proposal for energy storage. We have tentatively scheduled it to go in front of the Board of Governors for approval in December. So that allows us some additional stakeholder time with a draft final proposal tentatively scheduled to go out sometime in September. And then the final proposal for this element of ESDER 4 to be published in November. And we will make some determinations as to the scheduling of potential additional stakeholder calls within this time frame to get us to a December board meeting. However, with the split out of this element, we do not foresee this having an impact on the overall ESDER 4 implementation, which is scheduled for fall of 2021. We'll go to the next slide. This is basically our policy initiative stakeholder process, where we are in the process. And for all elements of this ESDER 4, we are in the final proposal stage. Next step going in front of the board and the EIM governing body. As mentioned, we will have 4 elements that will go in front of the October board, and then that remaining ESDER 4 default energy bid proposal going in December. Okay, we can move on to the next. So within the final proposal that was published on August 20th, we have these 4 elements identified here that we'll be seeking approval on October 1st. And those are the end of our state of charge parameter for the non-generating resource model. We will, although there is not a proposal on the ELCC valuation for demand response resources, we will be including that as a discussion item for the board. The third item being the parameter for demand response resource to characterize its maximum runtime. And then the fourth element being the changes to the market participation agreements for non-generating resources. We will be going over all four of these items. In particular, the first two items had some changes since the draft final proposal that will be highlighted in today's discussion. Additionally, the proposal for applying market power mitigation to energy storage resources, as mentioned, will continue to be stakeholdered. We're kind of giving it the term of ESDER DEB, although as mentioned, we're still on track for the fall 2021 implementation. And as mentioned, there will be some additional publications specific to this proposal, as well as an additional stakeholder call and comment opportunity on these revisions as we move forward to that December board approval timeframe. And we have Bridget, who will be discussing the end of our state of charge and any of the changes since the draft final proposal. Lauren will be talking a little bit about the ELCC discussion, and I will go back and go over the two remaining items, as well as Dave will present slight changes that were made to the ESDER 4 final proposal paper on the default energy bid, and he will give a little bit more discussion as to the decision to break this out and to do some additional revisions on the proposal. So with that, I will hand it over to Bridget Sparks.
Thanks, Jill. Good morning, everybody. If we can move to the next slide, please. So there hasn't been substantial changes to the end of our state of charge parameter itself. There will be more clarifications on how the market sees the constraint, and then some additional clarifications on bid cost recovery. But just to get started, as a reminder, the end of our state of charge parameter is an optional real-time parameter that can help resources more flexibly manage their state of charge. And originally, this parameter was intended to support multi-use application and storage as transmission assets. But we're not placing any restrictions on who can utilize this. We are setting this end of our parameter can be submitted as a minimum or maximum megawatt hour range. So it can be set at a range of values, or if the min and max is set at the same value, it'll be a specific target. Again, this parameter will be used and prioritized over other economic outcomes in the market. However, the market will respect the end of hour state of charge needed to fulfill an ancillary service award, as well as respect the physical minimum max charge constraints that are stored in master file or that are also bid in. So this parameter will work in conjunction with those other features. In the draft final proposal, we provided additional clarification on how this end of hour parameter might impact RA resources. And so we clarified that under the current RA paradigm, the expectation is that the end of hour state of charge shouldn't be used to impede a resource's ability to achieve its 4-hour RA obligation. And then, as most folks are aware, we are going through a major revision of our RA requirements and are trying to implement a UCAP paradigm, which is our unforced capacity, which takes into account a resource's force outage rate in valuing the capacity value. And so in that initiative, we are also considering treating this end of hour state of charge parameter as a D rate on a resource's availability, which could impact its UCAP value. And this will potentially be implemented in 2023. So again, we are still in the process of finalizing how we might treat the end of hour state of charge parameter under a UCAP paradigm. And so stakeholders should also follow along in that initiative to get additional details on how this parameter might be treated moving forward under a UCAP paradigm for RA. Additionally, the CAISO reserves the right to monitor for abuse of the end-of-hour parameter and may bar a resource from utilizing the parameter in the future if it is proven that the resource is using this to withhold capacity unnecessarily or using it to manipulate the market in any way. So again, we will continue to monitor its use once implemented. Next slide. So again, with the implementation of the end-of-hour charge parameter, there's also a need to modify bid cost recovery rules. So as a reminder, in previous iterations, we had proposed to exclude the hour prior to when an end-of-hour was submitted from bid cost recovery. However, there were concerns around gaming opportunities if we excluded both any revenue surpluses as well as revenue shortfalls that may occur in this period. So in the final proposal, we are only going to modify contributions to the real-time BCR calculation during intervals when the energy award revenue is less than bid costs in that hour prior to the end of our parameter. And to clarify, we're making no modifications to the ancillary service award components of BCR settlements. So this proposal will only apply to, again, the energy and energy bid cost components of the BCR calculation. And so there were some stakeholder questions about how ancillary service awards would sort of interact with this BCR proposal, and we wanted to, again, clarify that we're only making modifications to the energy award and energy bid cost components of this daily settlement. So during that 2-hour period in which the end-of-hour state of charge parameter is active in the market, for each 5-minute interval, if the bid cost is greater than the revenue generated in that interval, then it will be set to 0 to basically get rid of any shortfalls during that interval. But if the bid costs are less than revenues, then there'll be no change in the interval, and any additional surpluses can carry forward to the final daily settlement. So what this does is it excludes intervals with an uneconomic dispatch, but it allows any additional revenue surpluses to flow through to the daily real-time BCR calculation and can be used to cover BCR shortfalls in other periods without an end-of-hour stated charge parameters or self-schedule submitted. And this is to address potential gaming opportunities identified by GMM and the CPUC. Next slide. So in this BCR proposal, we have also stated that we're going to extend the BCR settlement modifications to the hour prior to a self-schedule, because a self-schedule can also lead to potentially uneconomic dispatches as the market is trying to line up the resource such that it can meet its self-schedule. And through initial impact assessment discussions internally at the CAISO, we recognize the need to clarify modifications to BCR eligibility for self-schedules under different scenarios. So we identified 4 possible scenarios in which a resource could utilize a self-schedule and how our BCR proposal would be modified. So in the first instance, a resource can either bid in or submit self-schedules to meet their day-ahead awards. And so if the real-time self-schedule is a restatement of the day-ahead award, then it will remain eligible for real-time bid cost shortfall payments. Because the resource is trying to follow CAISO dispatch instructions based on day-ahead market outcomes, and so it seems fair to us that they should still be eligible for BCR because, again, the resource is trying to respond to CAISO instructions. Under the second scenario, if the real-time self-schedule is an increment or decrement of the day-ahead award, because the resource is modifying its day-ahead schedule, and it's something that it's choosing to do, it will become ineligible for real-time bid costs shortfalls in that hour prior. Under the third scenario, in addition to submitting self-schedules, resources can also provide additional economic bids And so if there's a real-time self-schedule with an economic bid that has a dispatch associated with that bid, then that resource will remain eligible for real-time bid cost shortfalls. However, if it submits a real-time self-schedule and an economic bid and there's no further dispatch on that economic bid, then it will remain ineligible for real-time bid cost shortfall payments because, again, the market is mainly responding to that real-time self-schedule. And so, again, the resource will be ineligible for real-time bid cost shortfall payments. So, again, we want to provide some further details and clarifications around how the BCR settlement for self-schedules will be implemented. And I'll do one more slide, and then I'll pause for questions. So if we can move on. And then finally, again, we recognize the need to align visibility of this parameter across the 5- and 15-minute market. And so in order to do that, we are going to implement an end-of-horizon constraint, which will be applied at the end of the last 5-minute RTD run. And it will be set to what the end-of-hour state of charge target constraint is, adjusted for the resource's charging capability between that ending 5-minute horizon and the final end-of-hour horizon. So again, there hasn't been change to how we're going to implement this constraint. But one additional detail we wanted to clarify is based on feedback we received from the MSC meeting in July, there was an additional need to clarify when STUC would see the end-of-hour state of charge bit information. So a reminder, STUC runs 4 hours, looks out 4 hours to see if there needs to be additional medium start resource commitments. So again, it has no impact on the charge or discharge of a storage resource. It only looks to see if it needs to commit additional medium start resources. And so meeting this end-of-hour state of charge parameter could influence STUC's decision to commit or not commit additional resources. And because, again, this looks out 4 hours, it could potentially see this end-of-hour state of charge information earlier than other markets. However, because a scheduling coordinator can submit and make modifications to the end-of-hour state of charge parameter up until the close of the real-time market in which that end-of-hour state of charge will be binding, i.e. T-minus 75 minutes, you could imagine scenarios where a resource submits a high end-of-hour state of charge parameter earlier in the day, and if we release that to STUC as soon as it was available, that could influence commitments. And then because that information can be modified up until 75 minutes prior to the close or to the binding of that constraint, you could imagine a scenario where they could then change it and somehow gain commitment of other resources. And so in order to sort of prevent any of those gaming or manipulations of commitments of other resources through the end-of-hour state charge parameter, we have decided that we will only release the end-of-hour state charge bit information to STUC once the real-time market has closed. And so this will sort of release the same bit information between STUC, RTPD, and RTD. And so we wanted to provide clarifications on, again, how STUC would see this parameter. And we recognize the need to sort of prevent a potential gaming opportunity if we release this information earlier. So that is it for clarifications on the end-of-hour state of charge parameter. I will pause now for questions and comments. Thank you.
All right, when we have any questions, please press #2 on your telephone keypad to be connected to the question queue. And it looks like we do have one question on the line. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question.
Good morning. This is Aldo Svoboda from PG&E. Can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi. I had a couple of clarifying questions, and we'll go back, but I want to start on this slide first. This is just to get clarification on the rules. The end-of-hour state of charge will not be actually used in the market systems until the binding hour-ahead process, or I don't know if you call it binding hour-ahead process, but the HASP process essentially, and then from that point forward, it will be used in all of the real-time processes, and it could also be released to stuck. Is that a correct interpretation of that last bullet?
Yes, that is my understanding. Greg, correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah.
That's correct. This is Greg.
So the one thing that I haven't even thought about is I just wanted to raise it. One thing that's kind of troubling about this is just that essentially by putting that target, because you have this BCR effect that you're removing BCR 2 hours in advance, essentially you're invalidating or disallowing BCR for the prompt hour 15 minutes ahead of time by putting in a target. That seems like a pretty small window in which to make a decision that could have an effect on your revenues. Just a thought. I was just a little thinking about that. It seems like there's definitely a risk involved there for bids that you don't have the ability to change anymore because you can't change those bids in the prompt hour. So that was one. Thanks for the clarification. Could we go back one more slide? The one thing I was a little confused about, maybe you could just explain, is what's the necessity for that first statement? If you don't put in anything, doesn't your day-ahead award get converted to a real-time self-schedule automatically? And why would there be a real-time bid cost shortfall in that case?
It's really to clarify. So in the papers prior, we have sort of talked about self-schedules under sort of an umbrella term. And through discussions with settlements, we realized that there was a need to sort of further clarify that. So you're right, in the first instance where the self-schedule is just a restatement of the day-ahead award, then we wouldn't want to modify BCR should it occur for whatever reason. So that was just to sort of clarify that when we talk about that we're modifying BCR, these are the set circumstances in which we're going to implement that. So we just want to provide more implementation details.
Yeah. Okay, got it. So it's just like an edge case where maybe you uneconomically curtail the resource or something like that would be but in general there wouldn't be actual RT bid cost recovery in that. Certainly not in that hour at least. Okay, and then the other thing I was just more generally interested in getting your thoughts on is how you were planning on. Can we go back? It's essentially the monitoring of the use of the parameter. You described a monitoring function which sounded kind of like real-time monitoring, so you'd basically be able to detect the effects of the use of the parameter. And I was wondering, are you going to have real-time monitoring that will sort of detect whether the state of charge parameter is causing effects in the energy market, or is this something that you expect to do as a review function? Because it would really make a difference in terms of how likely you are to catch or alert people to these issues, depending on how you're setting that up. So I was just curious what your thoughts are on that monitoring function that you were planning on performing.
So right now we're imagining that as more of a after the fact, and if there's sort of repeated evidence of abuse or manipulation, then we would reserve the right to sort of restrict the use of that parameter by the offending party. And so we're still working internally to figure out how exactly we would go about that monitoring process, but we just wanted to, notify people that that is our intent to, because this is an optional parameter that we don't have, you can imagine a lot of scenarios where a bad actor might abuse this parameter, and so in order to, provide some preliminary safeguards against that, we want to make sure that folks are aware that we are intending to, sort of examine how folks are using this parameter, and, if we, folks like DMM and our internal monitoring teams, if they identify, a bad actor, that then we reserve the right to, sort of take away this optional parameter from them and sure prevent further abuse.
And
so
Alex,
right now we're.
So Alva, this is Gabe Murtaugh here. As you know, we're going to have a lot of new storage resources on our system over the next year, and our internal team that does review market data is planning to do holistic tests in addition to this individual test for storage resources. We want to understand better how these resources are performing in our market. Once we have a deeper penetration of them, we want to know, how frequently they're bidding, how frequently they're self-scheduling, all kinds of stuff like that. So as these resources come online, this is going to be one of many variables that our internal teams are going to be looking at for review for the storage resource fleet.
Certainly. I would ask you to continue thinking about how to draw bright lines there, because to me, this is an area where, for example, DMM could look, they could see something that they felt was suspicious, but they could not confirm, and you'd basically be in a situation where you have to defend your hourly bids from months back, and it could be quite a data-intensive process on the side of the market participant as well. So just, in a sense, I, prefer kind of automated functions that just say this is an indication that that a rule has been broken, and you're given a warning, or even you're not given a warning, but you consider to have failed a test. But just something to think about there is how to make that as transparent as possible, so market participants, because the thing is, these interactions could be very subtle sometimes. You might not even understand what the effect of putting in a state of charge parameter is going to be. It may appear to be working. You may not realize something has gone wrong until you're alerted by the DMM that it appears you've been a bad actor. And so just something, it's not, I definitely think there's the possibility of strategic behavior using this parameter, and so I agree with your approach, but just ask you to sort of try to come up with bright lines for that. And then one last thing, does the fact that you're going to potentially disqualify batteries from submitting that parameter, does that mean there'll be a master file field essentially that will tell you are or are not eligible? And also, will there be a way to cure if you are disqualified?
We haven't gotten to that level of detail, but those are definitely things to consider, and I think are something that we could reasonably accommodate. And so I'll definitely take that back to the team.
Okay.
Yeah, and Alva, this is John. I really appreciate the feedback you're providing. I think, like Gabe said, this is sort of a safety pin. We're just saying, hey, look, folks, heads up. This stuff is new. These parameters are new. No one's really ever done this before. This is something that we are going to evaluate more like in an auditing ex post way versus some sort of real-time evaluation or mitigation. And frankly, I don't even know if we would know on any particular day or hour if that was some sort of strategic bidding behavior. I think it's more behavioral and patterns that we're going to be looking for initially. So I get your point, but I'm not even sure we could, quote unquote, see it in any particular hour.
Right.
At this point, we learn more about it. But I think your point's well taken. That would certainly be something we'd aspire to. And then as far as some of these other details, the specifics, that's certainly right for tariff and BPM type of language. But again, for the policy, this is just sort of a broad brush, stroke of, hey, folks, heads up. We are going to be talking more about this, about how we monitor these things.
That's great. Thank you, John. I had one last thing. It's actually not a comment on the slides, but you had one other in the proposal. I still just wanted to register that I don't see how the real-time state of charge parameter can ever conflict with the day-ahead initial state of charge parameter, because that parameter is used in the day-ahead process, and essentially after that, it's no longer in use. It's just simply used to derive the schedules. It's not a constraint, as I understand it. So unless that initial state of charge is being used by you to actually force an initial state of charge on the battery, I didn't see the validity of this idea that you can't, what happens at 11 o'clock at night when you're looking at 1 o'clock in the morning? In my mind, you're just putting a state of charge parameter in potentially for the 1:59 p.m. There shouldn't be any issue with the fact that you're doing that overlapping with the and maybe I'm choosing the hours wrong, but you're overlapping with the change of date, because the day-ahead market is dead and gone at that point. So I still sort of disagree with that point being raised in the proposal.
To clarify, are you asking about, I think in a footnote we said you shouldn't submit one that crosses trade dates?
Right. It was essentially that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we're still working on implementation details, and so in one conversation it sounded like there were problems with the market processes to allow something like that. It's really more so for hour ending 1 because, again, you're kind of crossing the dates. But there, in another conversation, it sounded like it might be possible. So I think that'll be worked out in the DPM. So I will take your feedback to the team to see if we can see that's something that we can allow.
Thanks very much, Bridget. I appreciate all your responses on the questions.
Yeah, thanks for your feedback.
All right, we do have one more question on the line.
Mm-hmm.
Caller, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with Klika. Can people hear me okay?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. The question I have for the ESDER 4 proposal is how is it going to work with grid emergency conditions? And the reason I bring this up is in the recent heat wave experience, on Friday, August 14th, batteries were started charging at 8 p.m., yet the CAISO didn't end the stage 3 emergency until 8:38 p.m. So batteries were in a state of charge while there was rotating outages in a stage 3. And then again on August 18th during a stage 2, batteries were also doing a state of charge for about an hour from 6 to 7 p.m. while there was, again, a stage 2 emergency. So is CAISO going to look at the ESDER 4 proposal and how this will affect the operation of batteries during grid emergencies?
Say, Paul, this is John again. I'll take that one. You know, we've noticed some of the behaviors as well as we're doing the post-mortem on the events. And so I think the issues you raise are definitely ones that we're going to be looking at. As far as ESDER 4, it's not something that we, will take up in this particular initiative, given, we're wrapping this one up. But I can say that if there are concerns about how resources were operated during those events, then we certainly will need to address those. But yeah, rest assured, we're looking at it. It's very interesting, but we'll have to address that in a different initiative. But thanks for the question.
Okay.
All right. There are no additional questions currently in the queue.
Great. Well, thanks for your feedback, and we'll move on to Lauren. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thanks, Bridget. This is Lauren Carr. If we could go ahead and move to the next slide, please, page 9. Today, I am going to be going over the vetting application of ELCC for valuing variable output demand response. In the ESDER 4 process, we took a look at a first step in exploring how an ELCC could be used to value demand response with variable load curtailment capability or energy limitations. And this is really something that we're looking at to evolve the RA program and ensure the RA fleet can meet capacity and energy needs at all times of the year. As we move into the future, California will rely more heavily on variable and availability limited resources as we move to decarbonize the grid, and it's critical to assess the ability of preferred resources to displace both capacity and energy provided by traditional thermal. ELCC is the CAISO's preferred approach to value the capacity of variable and availability limited resources because it considers how the resource fleet interacts to meet reliability targets and considering that variability and availability of resources during times of need. So as a part of this process, E3 analyzed the ELCC value of certain DR programs on the CAISO system today, as well as what that value would look like in the future. The study found that the ELCC value for DR differs from the current CC values that they receive from the load impact protocols for 2 reasons. First is that DR doesn't bid in aggregate at levels equal to its MQC value based on the data that was used in the study. And then also the times when DR was bid is either not at optimal times or not for long enough to earn the full ELCC value. So if we can move on to slide 10, please. The other items that were included in the ESDER 4 process was an allocation methodology that E3 provided for stakeholder consideration that would allocate DR's portfolio ELCC to different program types with different program characteristics such as duration or number of calls. And this is something that we heard from stakeholders that was important to DR providers in order to ensure that DR programs that are available for longer duration or at different times or at greater number of calls were considered when looking at what the ELCC value should be for those programs. Additionally, the ISO included a proposal that would accompany an ELCC methodology that would allow DR to fulfill its offer obligations by bidding its full variable capability rather than a fixed value without being subject to rain penalties. A part of this proposal is to recognize that DR could have variable capability over the course of the day. That could change hour by hour due to time of day, weather, production schedules, or other factors. And we think that the ELCC proposal coupled with these offer obligations would be the best way to reflect that variability. And again, I'll just mention that this ELCC methodology that we explored in the ESDER process is just the first step, and additional work will need to be done at the LRA level before something like this is implemented, and then these proposals would be considered in tandem at that time. Let's move on to slide 11. In the final proposal, we did not make modifications to the variable output demand response proposal or the study, but we did incorporate some stakeholder feedback that we received on the study results from FCE and PG&E, who helped us with the data that was used in the study. Following the May 27th stakeholder call on the draft final proposal and the study, Southern California Edison identified a portion of their resources. Bid volumes were limited by the CAISO's discrete dispatch size limitation. This is something that was discussed a little bit in the MSD call in July, but we wanted to flag it here as well so stakeholders can consider that when they're looking at the study results. Since then, SCE informed us that they refined their bid volumes and the size limitations so they can fully reflect the capability in their bids, and those wouldn't be limited by the discrete dispatch. And we appreciate the work that was done by SCE related to this effort following the ELCC study. And we think that these modified bid volumes should be considered in future studies that would be used to establish ELCC values going forward. While we weren't able to incorporate these within the ESDER process, we think that stakeholders should still consider the methodology that was used in the ESDER 4 study and consider that approach, how it was done, and how it could be improved or modified and refined going forward so it can ultimately be adopted in the LRA QC process. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to slide 12, please. This is my last slide, and then I'll open it up for questions or comments. We received additional feedback on the study results for the ELCC. SCE and PG&E both informed the CAISO in their comments that demand response resource bids do not include the 15% PRM adder and the line loss adder that is included in the qualifying capacity value of demand response. In the study slides, we do explain, or E3 does explain how those adders are included in today's CC values that are given to demand response. And just to clarify, SCE and PG&E informed us that the bids do not include those. We also had discussions with the Market Surveillance Committee at their July meeting, which indicated their general support of the development and continued refinement of ELCC and how it can be applied to demand response. So that's some of the feedback that we got on the draft final proposal. I wanted to share that with stakeholders for their consideration as they continue to review the study results and think about how these can be continued to be refined going forward in other processes. And with that, I'll go ahead and pause for questions
or comments.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, #2 will enter you into the verbal question queue. And we do have 2 questions in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question.
Hi, this is Alan Wong from SCE. Can you guys hear me okay? Hello?
We can hear you, caller. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you to the CAISO team for incorporating the language into the final proposal. The added language definitely kind of tries to shed some light on why E3's findings were concluding that DR wasn't bidding to its full NQC. So the additional language definitely attempts to clarify that, and we appreciate it. We look forward to vetting the ELCC methodology and the RA proceeding with, the CAISO, CPUC, and various stakeholders. And again, this effort that we've worked with the CAISO to correct the bids was just to ensure that the inputs we use is correctly reflecting the capabilities of the program. So again, looking forward to working with the CAISO in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. We appreciate all your help and collaboration on this effort as well, and we look forward to talking about it more in the future. Thanks very much for that comment.
Yeah, and Lauren, this is John Good. I just want to, one little clarification caveat that we appreciate that Edison went back and reevaluated their programs and came up with, I think it was about 130 megawatts. But I just want to alert folks to be sure to understand what that means, that that's not like every hour was off in our study by 130, because again, these bids vary and they're shaped, and that 130 is sort of the max that would ever be added to the data. It would obviously be less than that in other hours. So it's a nuance, but it's an important nuance that the study isn't that far off.
All right, we are moving to the next question in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question.
Hi, this is Noah Tong from SDG. Lauren, real quick, just some basic questions, I guess. Can you remind me whether or not that the ELCC was, you guys are looking at whether it's average versus marginal ELCC? We've had these types of discussions at the CPUC on wind and solar resources as well.
Yeah, thanks. E3 looked at both average and marginal. They refer to it as first in, last in the study. And yeah, I know this conversation has been happening a lot with wind and solar at the CPUC, and that's something that would have to be incorporated for DR as well.
Okay. And do you expect the ELCC to be run like on an annual basis, or as the ISO is updating the NQC list, or is this more similar to what the CPC does, is every so often, every couple of years, when there's a change to the methodology, it seems?
Say, Noah, this is John. Again, the purpose of this was to inform stakeholders in the commission that it's absolutely appropriate and possible to employ an ELCC methodology to evaluate DR. How we actually go about doing it at the PUC and how often and all of those kind of questions, that wasn't the intent. But those are important questions that will have to be worked out at the commission, including, average versus marginal, all of those types of debates. So definitely more discussion forthcoming.
I guess, thanks, John. That leads, I guess, to my next question, which is, in the ISO's tariff, does this mean, based on this proposal, and you guys go to the Board of Governors, does that mean that the ISO is going to be making changes to its default qualifying criteria in its tariff for demand response to reflect the ELCC methodology, or is it is this simply a here's our study, we expect to present it to the CPUC, and we're not making any changes in the tariff itself?
Yeah, no changes in the tariff or default at this point. Not that that couldn't occur in the future, but again, I think, this is a first step. It's an informative step, and that's what it's intended to do and be, is to inform. But this is not reflective in any tariff provisions at this point.
Gotcha. And then, so if the CPUC were to adopt an ELCC methodology for demand response, and the ISO needs to go forward, sort of in lockstep with implementation of the variable sort of bidding methodology, is that does the ISO then need tariff revisions as well, or is this something that the ISO could just sort of turn on a switch and say, well, DRs, we'll treat DR like a VER?
Again,
just trying to understand the implementation schedule here.
Yeah, I don't think that the ISO has to revise its default, although I think that would be prudent. But I don't think that's a stumbling block to moving forward. Essentially, we would be accepting what the qualifying capacity value is for DR from the LRA, the PUC in this case. Again, I'm not contemplating that there's mandatory tariff revisions or amendments necessary to make this happen if the PUC decides to set the QC for DR on this type of methodology.
Right. I guess my question was really about, does the ISO have the software capability now, or does it need to make software changes to implement the variable DR, sort of ELCC as such?
Yeah, John. I think on that point, this is Jill, there has yet to be, because we're not taking this proposal for approval to the board, we have not initiated an impact assessment as to that component of this item within the ESDER 4 proposal. So I think, Noah, this would be something that we would have to determine whether there are system impacts to be able to achieve, the capability of allowance of a variable bid for these type of resources. So, however, at this point in time, again, since it's not a proposal that we would be seeking tariff amendment for, we haven't really looked at that impact. I suspect there may be some implementation impact.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Jill. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get a better understanding, is what Lauren said or in the proposal that if the CPUC were to take this up, then the ISO would proceed. I'm just trying to understand how soon, how quickly that would occur, knowing the RA proceeding, let's say 3B or something, 3A, and in Q1 or even Q2 next year. What are the things that are necessary to get, maybe is it a fall 2021 implementation, or is it a 2022 schedule that we're thinking about?
Yeah, I think it'd be 2022, not 2021.
Understood. Thanks so much.
And just another note on that, as you may recognize, we were in the proposal within the ESDER 4 discussion about what changes might be needed within the ISO system. We were attempting to utilize functionality that already exists for VERS. So we anticipate that could be developed as we're moving forward with the CPUC. Any specific implementation details could be developed as we're moving forward through that process that you mentioned within the RA proceedings.
Great, thank you.
All right, we are moving to the next question in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with CLICA. I'm going to respond to John Gooden's comment, and then I'll make a comment on the Market Surveillance Committee meeting. So again, I want to thank Edison and PG&E for pointing out the issues with the study and the PRM and the line losses and the additional 130 megawatts. But I do disagree with John Gooden's conclusion that those issues doesn't affect the results of that study, and that trying to use that study to do a value judgment of the performance of DR in light of these issues cannot be done, and I'll just leave it at that. Regarding the Market Surveillance Committee meeting, I also was at the, listening to the meeting, and people walk away with kind of, what they'd like to hear, but one of the members also expressed concerns about the complexity that's now done with the reliability model that's behind the ELCC and getting the correlations between loads, solar, wind, and all these other parameters right, because if you don't, then the resulting, results, cast doubt. And so, so there was definitely some caution about these reliability models at the Market Surveillance Committee meeting. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Paul, for those comments. And it is definitely something that is complex and has a lot of details to it that will need to be addressed in the future. But I think overall, as a first step in coming up with a methodology, that's really what the CAISO was getting at in this ESDER process. And so I think that's what we're, looking for stakeholders to comment on and provide feedback like stakeholders have been doing throughout this process so that we can work through some of those complexities and see how this could be implemented in the future. But we appreciate your comments.
All right. There are no additional questions in the queue.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody, for your comments and feedback. I think with that, I will hand it over to Jill to talk about the runtime parameter for demand response.
Okay, yep, let's move on to slide 13. Okay, so this was a item within the ESDER 4 proposals that has really had no changes since early iterations of the proposal. So there was no changes within the final proposal that was published, but just wanted to go back to remind everyone of this additional component of ESDER 4. And it is about the establishment of a new operational parameter, specifically the maximum daily run time. And just as a review, this was really an issue that came out with respect to designs of demand response programs and the fact they had limited number of activations and a set number of hours available for dispatch within a day. That could not be as accurately reflected in the available constraints, such as the energy limitation constraints, that an actual set number of hours or maximum daily runtime constraint could provide. So the proposal provided demand response resources, and these are both for the PDR and RDRR resource models, a new daily maximum runtime constraint. And within the paper, there's multiple examples of how this would be utilized within the market and the resulting market results both in the day ahead and in real time in the use of this constraint. It is an optional master file parameter, so not a requirement to be used, and we anticipate that there will be some demand response programs that really would need to use this parameter, but there will be many others that are participating as a PDR or RDRR that do not need to use this. So it is an optional constraint. And we did put in some provisions because of concern over the impact of system performance. So we did put in a minimum size threshold for use of the parameter of 1 megawatt curtailment capabilities. And this was really, again, due to the concern of the optimization, having to utilize this constraint with hundreds of fractional megawatt resources. These are very small resources in the 100 kW size. So really, again, we felt that this was a reasonable step forward of having this minimum curtailment size of 1 megawatt for these type of programs that need to utilize this master file parameter. And again, no changes to the final proposal for this particular item within ESDER 4. And so open it up for any questions that you may have on it at this time.
All right, we do have questions in the queue. As a reminder, #2 will enter you into the question queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question. Caller, you may go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Sorry, I had myself muted. Joe, I had 2 questions on this. One is the minimum 1 megawatt curtailment size, is that based on the master file, or if for something that is variable by day, if it's below the 1 megawatt level, is there some thing that makes it ineligible on those days to use the parameter?
It would be based on the master file maximum size capability.
Okay, great. And then the other one I was curious about, I mean, it may not be important, but I was just wondering if the hours that are curtailed include the hours where the ISO regards the curtailment as having been taken would include hours with 0 curtailment. Would those be indicated in any way, or would you just, you can sort of tell when there's been a non-zero curtailment, but we're talking about commitment in this case. Would there be any indication that the maximum number of hours there was another hour that had been taken towards that constraint, and essentially that the ISO was regarding the resources having been curtailed, even though they chose to curtail it at 0?
Correct. That would be taken into consideration as to the number of hours. And that was something within the paper, that there was some concern about the fact that we may commit it over those 4-hour period of time, but never utilize the energy portion of it. We did kind of vet that within the proposal within the ESDER 4, but it would be taken into consideration even at a 0 megawatt commitment. Right.
So would that information be visible in any way to a market participant in CMRI?
Outside of the actual commitment hours or the dispatch hours, I don't think we're specifically identifying that.
Okay.
It's just a recognition.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Is there still a commitment hour report that would be visible in? I remember there used to be one, but I don't.
I think, Greg, are you familiar with a commitment report that this month could be identifiable within, Greg Ford?
I'm not familiar with that report.
Okay. It's just something to, I mean, I don't know how, it's essentially, you know, I think when we see this is one of the things that's helpful about this is essentially the ISO's telling the market participant when they're calling the program, even if it's not, even if it's at a zero level, but if that information isn't visible to the market participant, that would be of questionable use. Thanks, Jill.
Yeah, I think there is a combination of information, and it's both in the day ahead, in the commitment, and then in the real-time dispatch. But again, in the proposal, we do indicate and show examples of how it could be committed within the day ahead and take into consideration this constraint, as well as then once the commitment is made, which potentially would be at the 0 megawatts, then what could happen within the real time when there's an actual energy dispatch. But just fundamentally, it will be considered when looking at both a commitment and a dispatch of energy.
Right. I was assuming that. I just wasn't sure there was going to be a way for market participants to even be able to tell. So I'll take a look at the
other than their market results, their commitment and their real-time dispatch results.
Yeah, I'm just not sure if there is a commitment to report, but anyway, thank you very much, Jill. Appreciate it.
Yep.
All right, we're moving to the next question in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question.
Hi, Jill. This is Nor from Olivine. With regards to the last question, I believe the commitment details are in ADS, so you can always pull from there. So just to be clear, the 1 megawatt, so that's a Pmax. The minimum Pmax is 1 megawatt. That seems clear. Does this parameter require the resource to be registered as use limited?
It does not.
Okay, thanks.
All right, and we're moving to the final question in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question.
Hi, this is Alan Wong from SCE. I do see that this max daily runtime parameter is scheduled to be deployed in fall of 2021 with Market Sim roughly in July of 2021. I guess my request or question is whether or not this parameter can be accommodated for a independent release of that schedule to have it sooner. Some of the reasons why it's important is that during the recent heat wave, we experienced CAISO dispatch SCE's resources to curtail. On some of the days, the resources approached their maximum event call per event per day, according to the retail tariff, and SCE had to manually take actions to ensure that that didn't get exceeded. In sort of preparation for the next summer, as we kind of look to customers to conserve, whether on their own or through demand response programs, it's pretty crucial to have this parameter in place to ensure that any sort of human error doesn't kind of play into that. Again, just wanted to see if that was a possibility.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments and that feedback, and we did see those comments as well. At this point in time, again, based on the process we move forward through in terms of implementing such a parameter, such a constraint within the markets, this one is a fairly complex one because it reaches and has impacts both to the day ahead as well as the real time, and then to our commitment processes. So at this point in time, there is not an ability to, we have not looked at the ability to kind of accelerate the development of this component. and the ability to use this constraint. So at this point in time, I would say it will not be available for the summer in terms of having a spring release. But comments are noted, and that may change, and we will keep all informed whether or not this might become available prior to the fall release.
All right, there are no additional questions in the queue.
Okay, so we can move on to our next slide, and the final element that will be going to the board in October 1st. It's hard, we're September board, but it's an October 1st timeline. And this is another element that we really had an issue about the inefficiencies of having a non-generating resource executing two different participating agreements, one being a participating load agreement and the other being a participating generator agreement. It did make sense to really streamline this and require only one agreement. So the proposal was to allow for non-generating resources to participate under a single participation agreement with NGRs that operate as both a load and generator, utilizing the PGA, and those operating as a dispatchable demand response required to only execute the PLA. So streamlining that agreement process. The other item within the proposal was that those NGRs currently under operation, operating under the two participating agreements, would not be required to re-execute or execute new agreements. A very straightforward proposal, one that we laid out early on in the paper iterations, and that has had no changes within the final proposal. Now, with this particular proposal, we have had requests both internally and from stakeholders to, again, earlier implementation. And the fact that we've done an impact assessment on this and we find no technology changes necessary, just process changes needed. So there is a plan to request an earlier implementation for this particular component of ESDER 4. It would require a separate tariff filing once approved by the board, but we believe that we can get this implemented prior to 2021. So as of 2021, these NGRs would be able to utilize the single, execute a single participating agreement going forward. Any questions on this particular item?
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question, press #2 on your telephone keypad. There are currently no questions in queue.
Yep, pretty straightforward on this one. So those are the four, again, we've outlined the 4 items that will be going to the board for the September board. And now I'd like to move on, as indicated before, while it is there has been slight modifications within the ESDER 4 final proposal on the market power mitigation, particularly the default energy bid proposal. So we're going to have Gabe go over some of the changes within the final proposal, as well as he will then kind of lay out what the next steps are for this for the default energy bid proposal. Okay, Gabe.
Okay, thank you, Jill. I appreciate it. I hope everybody out there is staying safe and healthy. Today just wanted to talk a little bit about the default energy bids. So operator, if we could advance one slide, please. The proposal that we outlined in this final proposal really wasn't very different from the proposal that we had in the draft final proposal. It included a default energy bid that had 4 primary components, which comprised of energy, losses, cycling costs, and opportunity costs. We also had some provisions that took some assumptions, and there were some major simplifications of the way that we were dealing with cycling costs. And the idea was to estimate an upper bound of what a default energy bid could be for any storage resources. We did have some feedback on the default energy bid that we outlined in the draft final proposal. We did take all of the comments that we got from that paper very seriously, and we did talk, at least to some extent, about some of the comments that we received. There were a few points of clarification that we included in the draft final, or in the final proposal, but I think, again, primarily the items that were included in the final proposal were very reflective of what was in the draft final proposal. The formulation that we've put forward here is a default energy bid that would remain fixed for the entire course of the day. So there would be one calculated for the day-ahead market, and there would be another calculated for the real-time market. But those 2 proposals wouldn't change over the course of running the day-ahead market or running the real-time market. And this is consistent with how our default energy bids are formulated today for other resources. However, it is a departure from what we had in a significantly previous earlier version of our proposal. And that's part of the simplifications and clarifications that we've done as this piece of the policy has developed. One thing that we note, and I think this was something that a few comments weighed in on, is that our default energy bid does not mitigate negative portions of the storage resources bid curve. And it does do mitigation similar to the way that our mitigation for all other resources on our market perform. However, what it won't do is it won't increase storage resource, it won't decrease storage resource schedules or, specifically tell a storage resource to charge if there's a negative price on the market and the resource is bidding in at a very negative level. So let's say the resource is bidding at negative 150 and actual prices materialize at negative 50. There's no sort of, we'll call it reverse market power mitigation that says, oh, we think negative $50 is a good enough price, so we're going to go ahead and force you to charge. That hasn't been a part of our proposal. This would be a major departure from what our current market power mitigation mechanisms do. So there'd be some pretty intense work in order to facilitate something like that, which isn't to say that we'll never tackle that, but it's just not something that we've tackled in this initiative. With all that said, and taking into consideration the comments that we did receive, I think there's relatively good support from the stakeholder community for this characterization of the default energy bid. I think we've certainly internalized a lot of the feedback that we've received from stakeholders throughout this initiative and tried to incorporate that and include that into the final formulation that was put forward in the final proposal. CMM, and I think there's a few others as well, had some specific concerns about accuracy of the default energy bid. I think we acknowledge that there are some shortcomings in terms of accuracy, and again, we're sort of working on an assumption that this is sort of going to be an upper bound of what costs might be. That may allow for some storage resources to exercise what the ISO would characterize as a small amount of market power potentially. Of course, the rules against market manipulation and, manipulating markets to profit are still in place, and the market power mitigation will still be working for storage resources. It just might not be quite as accurate as it potentially could be. I think in the future, as the ISO understands more about how storage resources work, and specifically how they work in our markets, we can try to enhance and further zoom in on, more accurate depiction of what these costs are. But for a first cut, for the first default energy bid that we're going to be applying to storage resources, I think this is a pretty good first step. If we could advance one slide, please. As most of you know, we did discuss the ESDER 4 initiative and specifically the default energy bid at 2 separate Market Surveillance Committee meetings. This included the meeting in May and another meeting in July. So there's actually a fair amount of discussion about, specifically about the default energy bid in both of these meetings. And there had been numerous internal meetings between the members of the policy team and the members of the MSC to discuss aspects of ESDER 4 as well as the default energy bid. Just recently, and I would also note the Market Surveillance Committee is producing a formal opinion for this entire initiative. The formal opinion will include a commentary on the default energy bid. In advance of the Market Surveillance Committee releasing this opinion, they've been in contact with the policy team, and they've offered some additional substantive feedback on the policy and the proposal that we have. In light of that feedback, that's sort of why we've determined to take a second or a third or a fourth look at the default energy bid, and that's why we're planning to change our timeline on this specific aspect of the proposal. Frankly, I think some of the ideas that the MSC put forward are pretty constructive, and I think they could help us further craft the default energy bid. I would also just note that I don't think that any of the proposals made by the Market Surveillance Committee would necessarily be large departures from what we have right now, but they could potentially help us more easily implement the default energy bid, and I think make it a more robust DEB to begin with. So with that said, 2 of the things that they've specifically called out that I think are worth our attention would be to consider not applying the default energy bid to storage resource owners that have very small storage resources. I think we would need to think about this a little bit more internally. We've had these conversations just over the last few days, so we haven't really had time to think seriously about this feedback. But it might be something worthwhile. I do know that is something that we've had commentary from some of the stakeholders on as well. It would obviously be, this kind of a proposal would need to be something that we would run by the Department of Market Monitoring before we propose anything formally. But it could be something that we implement. So we're going to consider that, I think, and we don't have a formal proposal on any of this right now, but we will have one in the next few weeks. So if you have comments on this, you can feel free to send those to me directly, or you can send them through the normal comments channel through the ESDER 4 initiative, and I'll get those and review them. But we will be posting a new draft final or updated draft final proposal specifically for the ESDER DEB, and it may include one or both of these items that's mentioned by the MSC, or it could potentially include nothing, and we just go forward with the proposal as is. We need to vet these internally first, though. The second item is that we might consider removing opportunity costs from the day-ahead default energy bid. The Market Surveillance Committee sort of went through our formulation and said, because the day-ahead market is looking out over the full 24-hour period, they're sort of already implicitly including the opportunity cost, because what our market software does is a cost minimization over the entire 24-hour period. You're essentially already weighing the costs and benefits of producing during 1 hour versus another hour, and you would only ever produce if you're a storage resource during the highest cost hours, because you're effectively reducing the marginal cost with constraints for congestion and things like that. But essentially you're reducing those higher marginal costs, and you would do that before you would reduce a lower marginal cost. So the point being there is that you wouldn't need that for the day-ahead default energy bid. We have no intention of removing this from the real-time default energy bid. This is something that we need in that formulation. Again, this is a conversation that we've had very recently, so with additional thought we might reconsider this, but this is sort of a high-level view of two pieces of feedback that we got from the MSC, which we're seriously considering at this point. Yeah, and the final note here on this page is just that we will be having a written proposal which will be formally presented to all the stakeholders, and it will be out on our ISO website for this specific initiative. We will be having a stakeholder call after that. Unfortunately, we're working internally with our teams. As everyone knows, towards the end of the year, the ISO gets fairly jammed up in terms of finding time to have stakeholder meetings. So we're currently working on a schedule for that, and as soon as we have it, we will post it publicly on the website. But we will, go through the normal stakeholder process for any changes that we make, and then after those changes are made and we get feedback on it, we will have a final proposal for the ESDER-DEB, and we'll have that in place sometime. We're targeting early November right now. That might come in a little bit earlier or a little bit later, but we will have those all in place for the December Board of Governors meeting, which is currently what we're targeting right now for just the ESDER-DEB. And as Jill mentioned, we will be implementing the default energy bid in some form in fall 2021, which will be on schedule with the rest of the components of the ESDER 4 initiative. So with that, operator, I will pause for any questions.
All right, once again, ladies and gentlemen, #2 will enter you into the question queue. And I do see we have a question in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question.
Good morning, Gabe. This is Alva Gini. I wanted to just express a little bit of a qualm about that, considering removing the opportunity component, opportunity cost component from the day-ahead default energy bid. I think, basically, there's not going to be an explicit cycling constraint on a battery. That's to be assumed at this point. That you're attempting to keep the cycling at an acceptable level to the market participant by virtue of how they bid in their variable O&M cost. But, fundamentally, that's going to be the parameter that they can use to tell you that that overuse of the battery is going to lead to degradation based on their expectations of the lifetime of the battery. Is the way I would say it. Is if you think the battery's going to last 15 years and you use it twice as much as they expect, it's only going to last 7 years, and so they've lost economic value at the end of the horizon. That's going to come into their variable O&M component. Presumably, you'll agree on a value based on some assessment of that. People will present their analysis, and you'll say, okay, that's good, but it still is subject to changes that happen in the market dynamically that you may not be able to address very quickly with that variable O&M component. And if their variable O&M has been based on an average 1 cycle a day kind of operation, and they might occasionally be operating more than 1 cycle a day, but they really want to make sure that in general they run at 1 cycle a day. Then having the other limit being that you can, if you wish, bid at the 4th highest forecast value for the day, and if that's correct, that bid will not be mitigated. Is a helpful way for the market participant to be able to control the cycling on the resource. I think the Department or the Market Surveillance Committee is looking at this in kind of an ideal framework where everything is working as expected. But I think we all know that prices don't necessarily realize as expected, and so it's important to have to think about that additional control, especially in these early periods where we're really talking about 4-hour batteries. So there really is a limited state of charge for both the participant and the ISO to think about in constructing these bids.
Yeah, Alva, your point's well taken, and I think this is very much in line with the expectation that the ISO isn't necessarily, well, I think the first thing I should say is that the opinion that the MSC is planning to generate in the draft that I've seen right now is quite voluminous, and there are pages and pages and pages of things that they sort of propose. And I would agree, and I think the MSC would agree as well, that a lot of the proposals that they're making are sort of based on this idealized world that you're sort of suggesting. So I think everybody would agree on that. I also think that the ISO is in a position to say, well, we're not in an idealized world. We know that strange things happen in our markets. We know that this is a relatively new technology. So those are things we want to take into consideration. With that said, I do want to see feedback from stakeholders from this meeting and from our next meeting where we can discuss these matters a little bit more deeply. But like I said, I haven't fully really had a chance to go through all these comments yet, and there's a lot. So as we start to get a better feel for how these might actually. Oh, and the other thing I would mention is we haven't had an opportunity to run any counterfactual data like that, that mock data that I presented in the last version of the paper on how any of this might impact actual schedules. So we're going to want to do that too. And I think the comments from stakeholders, the comments from the MSC, actual opportunity to look at some data would all be factors when we would consider potentially changing our proposal right now.
Yeah, great. I do think if a market participant sort of submits a VOM to you, and then you say, well, that's not reasonable, and you cut it in half, they may well see themselves as anticipating excessive cycling, and then they would want to have another control on that, because these negotiated parameters are always subject to CAISO disagreeing with the market participant. So I think your thinking on this is very well done at this point. So thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you for that feedback, Alva. I appreciate it.
All right, moving on to the next question in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. You may ask your question.
Hi, this is Paul Nelson with CLICA. I had mentioned earlier the issue of batteries and the recent performance during the heat wave, and I identified two concerns, and John going to respond well. They're going to do an analysis on that, and that the ESDER 4 proposal won't address those issues. But if possible, if the Market Surveillance Committee could at least review the ESDER 4 proposal, while it may not resolve those concerns or what factors it contributed to the issues, perhaps they can provide an opinion that this proposal won't exacerbate what happened during the heat wave. And I know that's a lot to ask because, it would require the CAISO to kind of figure out what was the driver of the battery's performance in the two cases that I mentioned. But if that can be provided to the MSC so they can at least evaluate this proposal as to whether hopefully it won't exacerbate those conditions. So that's sort of my stretch request. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that is a stretch request, Paul. Just with the timeline that we're on right now, the MSC is actually planning to release this opinion in a week or two. The ISO postmortem on the events that happened last week could actually take quite a while. Obviously, we're trying to do a very thorough job on this and really cross all of our T's and dot all of our I's. So I think my suspicion would be that anything that the ISO formally states about, what happened on August 14th, may be a little while in coming, because we want to make sure we get the right answer and, we sort of identify the right causes. So my suspicion is because, the MSC has already spent so much time working on an opinion and drafting the opinion and getting it prepped, and essentially right now they're cleaning it up to make sure that it's ready to publish. I just don't see a way that we're going to be able to incorporate feedback from events that happened, a few weeks ago into an MSC opinion that was, they've been working on for months now. With that said, I'll bring that up. I've been in contact with the MSC over the last few weeks, and perhaps they might entertain something like that. But my feeling would be that it's doubtful at this point. But I do appreciate the ask.
And I realize with your current schedule, that was a very stretch ask, and I understand. I certainly realize that. But I think then that means maybe you do need to look at the schedule, because my observation has been, once rules or parameter are accepted and adopted into your tariff by the FERC, and then later you discover there's an issue or problem, it's much harder to change those to fix a problem than to sort of address it up front. Because invariably there'll be some party that perhaps is financially harmed by a proposed change who will then protest, the adoption of a tariff change. So I think there is probably the merits of the CAISO, looking at the schedule and definitely thinking deep on this, whether it merits, changing the schedule on this.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take that feedback back, Paul, and escalate that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
All right. There are no additional questions in the queue.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to Jill.
Okay. So I believe, Jimmy, you're going to take on the very last. So that is really ends the presentation for the ESDER 4 proposals. I think our next slide is just next steps. With regard
thanks,
to the
Jill, and hi, folks. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Thanks. Hi, folks. Had some technical difficulties at the beginning, but thanks, folks, for everything and your engagement, and thanks, Jill, and everybody for presenting today. As you know, we do have a comments tool available. You would go on the link that you see on the bottom part of the slide right there. If you haven't already registered, you would just register once to create a username. Then after that, you can submit comments on this initiative and any other initiatives moving forward. So we are asking by comments, as you can see, by September 10th. And as Gabe mentioned, you can look forward very shortly as well for a separate schedule regarding the DEB proposal piece. So once more, folks, we really appreciate your engagement, despite the current events out there, truly. And we look forward to your comments, and thanks for your participation throughout this initiative as a whole. So once more, thanks, and you can look forward to the recording to be available, within the next couple of business days. So thanks so much.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.